fermenting fruit is something that was not discovered or invented by human beings. We have lots of evidence even today of animals in the wild who look like they're drunk, because they've probably gotten a hold of some fruit that had fallen on the ground and started to ferment. So in that sense, fermented beverages are extremely easy. But the real issue is, how do we get a controlled product that is similar every time that we make it? So we can't just rely on the fruit falling on the ground and starting to ferment. So human beings, having discovered this fabulous fermented fruit, decided to try to regularize the process. And we have evidence from the Republic of Georgia and other places in the Near East that actually human beings were trying to control wine production and fermentation as far in the past as 8,000 years. We certainly have Egyptian tomb paintings where the cultivation of grapes is evident. We see figures that are cutting vines, that are cutting grapes off of a vine, and then they're putting them in some sort of a vessel. So the Egyptians definitively made wine and tried to perfect a process that would make wine in a similar fashion every time. The Greeks added much to our understanding of how to make quality wines. They explored different types of soil that might be beneficial for growing grapes. They looked at climate, what are the best areas to grow grapes, and they noticed the diseases that were eating the vines and tried to find ways of combating them. The Romans took what the Greeks had produced and added to it some very detailed information about grape varieties. I mean, entire books written about different varieties of grapes, which is better for which type of wine. And the wood barrel was actually first used by the Romans. Before this, wine was really preserved in clay amphora, which were very heavy and cumbersome. And so the wood barrel made it very easy to transport wine. And of course, we have evidence of grape growing and wine production throughout the Mediterranean region already during this very early period. Once we move into the medieval period with the collapse of the Roman Empire, the wine knowledge did not disappear, but it was brought into the monasteries. Manuscripts that described how to work with grapes to make wine were preserved. And of course, monasteries had vineyards. Wine, a very important component of the Christian religious service. So having a steady supply of wine was obviously very important. Vineyards, therefore, became a kind of form of land power, and owning a vineyard was a very prestigious thing. Mostly held by monasteries initially, but then transferred to the nobility as the centuries moved forward. And then, of course, it was the church that brought the knowledge of wine to what we call the New World, the world that the conquistadors and the French were exploring in the late 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. They brought wine, of course, to South America, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, a little bit about wine as medicine. We know from antiquity, actually, that, of course, wine was a central focus of many religious rituals. Deities that were dedicated to wine and to festivities around wine, like Dionysus in Greece, Bacchus in Rome. And in Egypt, we have evidence also of medicinal uses for wine, recipes actually for making wine for medicine. Now remember, this is a time when they're not making the Cabernet Sauvignon that we drink today. Very often wine was highly acidic, and they put herbs in the wine to mute the taste a little bit. And actually, both the alcohol and the herbs were beneficial for medicinal purposes. Now remember, of course, that wine was not the only alcoholic beverage that the Egyptians were making. We do have evidence that beer was one of the rations that the slaves were given. We know from the records of the pyramids. During the Greek period, Hippocrates, incredibly important physician, made copious notes about the importance of wine. It should be part of a healthy diet. It is also an excellent medium for mixing with other drugs so that they can be taken in a palatable fashion. And he also noted that wine might be good during childbirth to dull the pain. Now, the Romans, again, adopted the Greek, all of the important Greek understanding of wine as medicine. And Galen, a very important physician under Marcus Aurelius, one of the emperors, prescribed a daily dose of wine for the emperor as part of his diet. The Romans also used wine to disinfect the gladiators. The winning gladiator would leave the Colosseum and go to the Meta Sudans, which was a fountain located right outside of the Colosseum. If you have a chance to go there, they've actually excavated it. They would wash themselves and then they would disinfect their wounds with wine. Now, as we get to the Middle Ages, now remember, of course, I talked about the monasteries and their control of the wine trade. Monasteries were the only places where you could actually have your wine pressed. And then this allowed the monastery to ask for a 10% donation so that you would give them 10% of what you were pressing. Now, water for quite some time, actually until the late 19th, early 20th century, was not a very healthy beverage. The Romans were very meticulous about water, getting water to the cities, creating aqueducts. They were phenomenal engineers. And they actually had a very well-developed sewer system. They unfortunately also had some problems having to do with drinking, not just drinking too much, but also they had a tendency to line their drinking vessels in lead. So we know that one of the reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire may actually be lead poisoning, slow lead poisoning. The Middle Ages saw an increase in large urban areas. Unfortunately, they didn't take as much care of making sure that the water supply was good or that waste products were dealt with in as good a manner. So cholera and other waterborne diseases became kind of a staple, an unfortunate early pandemic in many urban areas throughout the world. Now, I mentioned wine, but I also have to mention other alcoholic beverages in terms of their medicinal value. Beer, excuse me, wine was of course limited to the elite. It was still an expensive beverage, but the poor had access to beer. And then once the Caribbean and had been colonized by the Spanish, the French, and the English, rum became a very cheap beverage in the New World and in the Old. Now, a little bit about wine today, of course, is much, much more than I can tell you in this one slide. But you probably have heard about the French paradox, which was talked about already a couple of decades ago. Well, this led to some new, very interesting explorations of whether or not wine might actually be healthy for us. The French diet tends to be fairly fatty, but the French tend to have fewer cardiac diseases than Americans. So this led scientists to wonder why. Well, they discovered that red wine actually leads to an increase in HDL, the good cholesterol, which removes lipids from plaques. Wine is also a mild blood thinner. It's an anti-clotting agent and an anti-inflammatory. We also know that it has antioxidants, resveratrol, saponin, and polyphenols, more so in red wine than white, but still present in white wine. And there's evidence also in other alcoholic beverages, but the real star of the show here is red wine. Now, of course, we always have to remember that any benefits of wine is through wine consumption in moderation, because any over imbibing will unfortunately may mitigate those effects. So, a little comparison and contrasting. If we compare and contrast areas of the world that make wine, it would be interesting to look at areas where similar grapes are the stars of production. I thought that an interesting comparison for us tonight might be Bordeaux versus California. In both these areas, as we're going to see, there's a shared history in some sense, historical links at least, similar grapes in both areas, but one key difference. France and old world wine countries, essentially we're talking here about Europe, tend to emphasize terroir, and new world wines, United States, North America, because we have to add Canada here, they're making quite a bit of wine up there now. The Southern Hemisphere here, South America, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa now, an important wine place, tend to have fruit forward. And this is a difference in how, excuse me, the wines are produced in the wineries. So, a little map just to remind us about France. We will be focusing this evening on Bordeaux when we do this comparison, but we'll also talk a little bit about Champagne up here in the north in a second comparison. But Bordeaux down here in the southwest, both the name of a city and the name of the surrounding region where wines are produced. So this particular area, if we look at French wine history, we can credit the Greeks who sailed around the Mediterranean. They founded the city of Marseille in the south on the Mediterranean, the place where the Rhone River and the Mediterranean Sea meet. And the Greeks brought vines with them and started the vines that now populate the Rhone River Valley. Romans then, after the Greeks, continued to invade other parts of France, more northerly parts of France, and Julius Caesar even mentions bringing vines with him when he conquered the Gauls. After the Roman period, the Catholic Church encouraged plantings in many of the areas that we still favor today, Burgundy, Bordeaux, Champagne. And the revolution, the French Revolution, however, changed the configuration of church wineries because the revolution, of course, was primarily against the nobility and the church, the two shareholders of the majority of French vineyards. And this led to confiscating the vineyards and subdividing the plots. So that changed the vineyard landscape quite radically. If we look at this Bordeaux itself as a region, so one of the important regions for French wines, it actually produces 10% of French wines with 20 to 25% of appellations. Now, appellations, which we'll say a few words about in a minute, are actually markers of quality. So appellations are geographically denoted regions that have a particularly mandated profile. In Bordeaux, wines are distributed via chateaus. You will see chateau on the label if you're buying a Bordeaux. This will not be the case in Burgundy, where you'll see a village. It won't be the case in Champagne, as we'll mention in a second, because champagnes are created by house styles. Now, the chateaus in the 10th, 11th century, when Eleanor of Aquitaine married an English king, Henry II, and brought Bordeaux to England with her, were family-run businesses. They were castles where people lived. Now, castles have become extremely expensive to run, so in many cases, the Bordeaux chateau are now run by large corporations, sometimes insurance companies, sometimes very wealthy Frenchmen or otherwise important organizations. By the way, we have seen in the last 10 years an increase in Chinese purchases of Bordeaux Chateau because of the incredible interest in China for red Bordeaux wines. I don't know what the current situation will be doing to that, but it's interesting to see the interest that the Chinese have in Bordeaux. Bordeaux is usually divided into two sections, one on either side of the Garonne River. The left bank is called the Médoc, and it's subdivided into Saint-Estèphe, Saint-Julien, Pauillac, and Margaux. And then when you're at Margaux, you're just north of the city of Bordeaux. South of the city of Bordeaux, you have the Grave, slightly less expensive Bordeaux, so a little bit more affordable, and Sauternes, which are mainly white, sweet dessert wines. On the right bank, you have Saint-Emilion, Pomerol, you have Angelus, etc. These wines oftentimes, these types of wines, by the way, on the right bank sometimes do not have chateaus on the label. Now, the climate then in Bordeaux is pretty ideal for growing grapes and making wine. It's a Mediterranean climate with dry, cool summers and mild winters. Of course, right on the Atlantic. The Atlantic is an important influence here. And the soil tends to see that it's mainly dry pebbles and stones. Now, wine actually loves really rocky soil, so this is not a problem. Minimal irrigation really is necessary for to make really good wines throughout the world. Actually, tropical areas are pretty bad for making wine because they're just too wet. Now, Bordeaux grapes tend to be clustered into certain varieties. If you have a chateau in Bordeaux, the expectation is you are going to use one of about 8 different types of grapes. The two absolutely main two types of grapes are Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. You can also have Cabernet Franc and a couple of other red grapes in the blend. The distinction between your chateau and the chateau next door is likely to be the percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon versus Merlot that's going to be in your wine. Now, as I mentioned, there is a small percentage of Bordeaux wines that are actually using white grapes, usually Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. Now, let's look at California. Now, just a word here. I'm talking about California as a unit because I'm considering California a subsection of United States wines in the same way that Bordeaux is a subsection of French wines. So just to clarify, probably the California region that is closest to the profile for Bordeaux wines is the Napa Valley, where we have a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon wine. So this is just a map. Many of you may have had a chance to go to some of these areas. I hope also to France. And you'll notice, of course, up here in the North Coast, just north of San Francisco, is where we have some of the most famous Napa Sonoma, but actually grape growing and wine production all the way down to the Mexican border. So a little bit about California wine history. We actually got our wine from Mexico, believe it or not. Cortez, when he conquered Mexico, brought with him vine cuttings and established monasteries. And those vines made their way to Southern California. In the 1700s, Padre Junipero Serra, who is best known probably for establishing the mission system up and down the coast, created a vineyard in San Diego, in the Mission of San Diego. So you probably know that there are missions that were established along the coast, about 20, 30 miles distance from one another, so that pilgrims could make their way from one mission to the other. Now, in 1824, the wine was still in the wine production was still in the hands of the Catholic Church. The Franciscan friars were the only producers, but that didn't last for long. By 1831, a Frenchman from Bordeaux was recorded as already producing wines in California. And then, of course, by the time we get to 1849 and the gold rush, the demand for wine, spirits of all kinds, food, supplies, goes through the roof in California, and so the market explodes. By 1849, a Hungarian, Count Haraszti, had brought 100,000 different cuttings of vines from Europe to experiment with how they would do in California. So 300 different varieties. So we really credit him with the first important experimentation with types of grapes. Now, California is a huge producer already by 1875. But we're going to see in a second that the phylloxera epidemic shortly afterwards makes production difficult throughout the world, and then it comes back to California. Now, of course, the United States history of wine wouldn't be complete without talking about prohibition. We're one of the very, very few countries in the world that has experimented with prohibiting a substance outright. And so prohibition disrupted the demand for wine and for all alcoholic beverages. But by the 1970s, California was back. It started immediately after the repeal of prohibition in 1933, but the quality level wasn't quite up there. But in the 1970s, California was back as a quality producer of wine. Now, California climate also Mediterranean, very dry, cool summers, mild winters, very mild average temperatures, maritime climate in the north with a little bit more rainfall as you get close to the Oregon border, and of course deserts in the south, but we saw that that doesn't prohibit them from having vineyards even all the way down to San Diego. The Pacific is an enormous influence on California wines. And if you really want to think about it, although California is a very long state and temperatures do vary quite a bit north to south, the greatest influence for wineries in California is actually from east to west. So it's proximity to the Pacific that counts the most. And the Japanese current coming from Japan, the Kuroshio current, actually influences the temperatures along the coastline quite a bit. This is peculiar to California. Now, California produces still 85–90% of the wines in the United States, and it also produces about 90% of our US exports of wine. They have a tremendous variety of wines. In order, Chardonnay is number 1, Cabernet Sauvignon is number 4. But you'll notice also French Colombard, Ruby Red, some wines that are mainly used either for grapes that are used mainly for bulk wine or for as table grapes. So a wide variety of types of grapes that are grown. Pinot Noir, you'll notice, is right down there at the bottom. We think of California Pinot Noirs quite often, but it's actually a fussy grape. So can't be produced in all over California and in enormous quantities. So we talked a little bit about comparing and contrasting. So let's look a little bit at some of the points of contact between wines from Bordeaux, wines from France, techniques from France, and in California. So first off, one of the obvious points of encounter were French pioneers going to California to explore and to bring their wine expertise. So a couple of names that you'll probably recognize here: Paul Masson, already in 1850, bringing wine technology and techniques to California. Probably the oldest, Okay, sorry about that, folks. Probably the oldest link you'll see there is 1881. Pierre Mirassou still has a winery, and now it's in its 6th or 7th generation. In the last 40 years, there have still been a lot of points of contact. You have French houses like Moët de Chandon, Domaine Carneros, Mumm, and many others that have come to either plant grapes or install wineries using California grapes, but then marketing their own types of wines. Now, grape varieties, also lots of points of convergence. We talked about the importance of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot in Bordeaux. We saw that there are also two important grape varieties for California. There's also an influence of Burgundy here because Burgundy really focuses on two grapes, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And you saw that Chardonnay is the #1 grape in California. And so that would be a Burgundian influence. Now, California, though, is not inhibited and continues to experiment with a lot of different types of grapes. So you'll see plantings and bottlings of Sangiovese, Albarino, etc. But probably the strongest production in California are still of those wines that are influenced by France and not by countries such as Spain and Italy. A couple of other points of convergence, some more advantageous encounters. The French were the first to create a system of quality designations in the world, the appellation system, as we mentioned earlier. It's a way of saying that if your wine says Burgundy on the label, those grapes were grown in Burgundy. If it says Chateau Margaux, those grapes were grown at Chateau Margaux, and so forth. Well, the US actually took some inspiration from this and created AVAs, or American Viticultural Areas. And our grape growing and wine producing areas now are subdivided into AVAs. They're a little bit less complex than the appellation, and there are new ones being created all the time, whereas in France, that might be difficult. I think all of the land that it has potential for growing grapes is pretty much growing grapes. But the AVAs, the AVA system and the principle behind it was inspired by the French. Now, a couple of other advantageous liaisons involve technology. Now, we talked about technology coming from the Greeks and the Romans, but the French added quite a bit of technology of their own. The sparkling method, which we'll talk about in a second, they frankly invented the bottle. Now, when you're in the Middle Ages and you have a chateau, you have your wine in barrels in the cellar, in the cave, and your servants go and open the tap, fill up a pitcher, and take the pitcher to the table. Well, that's not a real handy system for distributing wines unless you live in the chateau. So the invention of bottles, now glass had been invented under the Romans, and we have evidence even earlier than that of rudimentary glass production. But the idea of standard bottles to bottle wine and try to sell wine, we can credit that to the French. Now, the French and the English are kind of fighting it out about who invented the cork. Cork is made from the bark of the cork tree, and it's an extremely thick piece of bark. Let me show you with my hands, thick piece of bark, and then they stamp the cork into that. The cork was invented in the 17th century, and the French like to say that they invented it. We see that they invented the appellation system, but the Californians added quite a bit of modern technology to how we work with wines currently. Temperature degree days, which has now become a standard way of measuring when grapes are ripe to pick. You take the average temperature in your vineyard over the course of the growing season, and when you hit a certain temperature, you know that the grapes are probably ripe, so you should be starting to look at when you need to harvest. And then, of course, now a lot of work with computers and microclimate designations and so forth. The idea of the microclimate is that, you know, you have Napa Valley, which is very large, but your vineyard may be different from your neighbor's because your vineyard is cut off from the wind stream by a mountain and so forth. So the idea of the microclimate is increasingly important. A couple of other personal important liaisons that actually led directly to the improvement of California wines was a personal connection between Robert Mondavi and Baron Philippe de Rothschild. The Rothschild Chateau in Bordeaux is still one of the most famous. Mondavi knew that he had a raw material that was excellent, but he knew that the quality of his wines were not up to the caliber of Bordeaux. So through his personal ties with Rothschild, he was able to get the methodology, the type of barrels, the type of fermentation that was being used in Bordeaux, planted in California, and through that, improve the quality of California wines. And both of these gentlemen were actually marketing geniuses, so they knew how to capitalize on all of the things that they were in the process of inventing. A couple of other compares and contrasts are with, I guess we could call it wine expertise nowadays. Critics and counselors worldwide come from a variety of different cultures, but two very important influences in the wine world, one American and one French, have really shaped the modern wine landscape. Robert Parker, many of you may know The Wine Advocate, his magazine, still today considered one of the most influential American critics. He championed Bordeaux. He championed looking at ways to tell which Bordeauxs were better. And still today, through the Wine Advocate and through lecture series and competitions, the work that Robert Parker does is still very influential. In France, Michel Rolland was for quite some time probably the most important international, or sometimes called flying, enologist. Areas of the world where there wasn't a lot of expertise, but where the climate was excellent, needed help in establishing new wineries. So they relied on people like Michel Rolland, who would come over, analyze the soil, look at whatever structure was in the winery, and give some ideas on how to make quality wines. He was influential in South America, some influence also in Australia, New Zealand, etc. And so in this sense, still today, France and California, or the United States, are having a tremendous influence. There were also some disadvantages that linked France and the United States. The phylloxera bug. And right here is a lovely drawing of this louse, which attacks the roots of the grape plant, sucks up the juice, and thereby kills the plant. Now, American grapes were immune to phylloxera. The rest of the world didn't know this. So California grapes were imported to the Rhone Valley. And unbeknownst to the vintners in France, they were infected. Without immunity, phylloxera spread basically everywhere. There are only a few areas of the world, places with very sandy soil, like Algarve in Portugal, and the country of Chile, which is, as you know, very weird, long and thin. And so you've got the Pacific and the Atacama Mountains, the Atacama Desert on the north, Antarctica, and the Andes Mountains kind of hedging it in, so difficult for pests to get in there. Phylloxera, once they discovered what was killing their plants, they actually grafted Texan vine roots onto the vines of the world, and that was able to save the grape plants in other parts of the world. So, seemed like everything was going well. The genetic mutation of the phylloxera, however, meant that then it was reintroduced to California, which were no longer immune from this new mutation. And California, certain places in California also experimented with new rootstock. And of course, since the louse eats the rootstock, if you do anything to the rootstock, that might make it again favorable to phylloxera. So there are still outbreaks of phylloxera, but now worldwide we know how it happens. We know how to stop it. But this is an interesting negative connection between the two countries. So If we're going to compare and contrast wines from two different regions, from two different grapes, from two different varieties, from two different houses, one of the ways, of course, is a rating system. Parker invented a rating system, as did the Wine Spectator. This is just an example where you have, critics get together, they'll sample two wines, they'll give it a rating. Sometimes it's a 5-point scale, sometimes it's a 100-point scale. There are pros to this. Ratings permit comparisons of grapes, of years, it encourages quality. There are also some cons. It may make wines more uniform. In other words, vintners will try to make the kind of wines that are going to get 90 points. And that may face regional nuances. But in general, this comparing and contrasting is very much a part of the world in both countries. Now, you may have also heard about the Judgment of Paris, which was a real compare and contrast. In 1976, before California wines were really well known, there was a blind tasting of French wines versus California wines, and California won several categories, thereby really freaking out the French. And this actually made California wines known worldwide and gave incentives to people like Mondavi to really continue to improve the wine. So what is one of the real differences between a Cabernet Sauvignon in Bordeaux and a Cabernet Sauvignon in California, in two different areas of the world? In the old world, emphasis will be on terroir. In the winery, you will try to bring out those flavors that represent the soil, the earth. Musty flavors, stony flavors, flavors of bark, mushrooms, things like that. In the New World, in general, vintners try to bring what we call a fruit-forward style. That is, in the winery, you try to emphasize those flavors that are inherent to the wine. Cabernet Sauvignon, Cassis, maybe some cherry, maybe, depending, some leather, etc. So you try to bring forward the actual tastes of the that are in the grape. Now, a second contrast can be put together on a method, sparkling wine. The obvious contrast here is Champagne versus Prosecco. We're going to compare the two methods and then see about comparing the end product. And some of you may have actually come to one of the alumni events here in Chicago on sparkling wine and chocolates. So we're going to continue a little bit our discussion about sparkling wines. So first, just a little bit about Champagne history. Champagne, we're in France, so you know which kind of grapes are in your wine. You can't just do anything. It's a blend of Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and sometimes Mourvèdre. It is a wine made from high acidity wine that has been fermented once, and then you ferment it a second time in the bottle. And this is called the Champagne method. Now, we attribute it to France because one of the first records we have of experimentation to produce sparkling wine on a predictable, regular basis was thanks to Dom Pérignon. He was a monk in Auvilliers, a tiny town in Champagne, and he discovered that his wine was fermenting again when it was in the barrel. So he tried to figure out a way to make this happen on a regular basis because he kind of liked it. Then, of course, Champagne remained a drink for the elite in the 18th and 19th century. We know that it was the drink of the Russian court and of the British nobility. Now, as I mentioned earlier, champagnes are actually based on a house style, not a chateau, not a village. So Taittinger is a house. They blend Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Mourvèdre in certain doses, but they can blend different years together. And then you get the Taittinger style. Same thing with Veuve Clicquot. You get the Veuve Clicquot style. Now, the Champagne method is fermenting grapes as you would for still wine. And remember, only the Champagne is a region, it's a wine, and it's a method. And only wines that are produced in the Champagne region can be called Champagne. Now, you have wine in a bottle at this point, but you want to get it to sparkle. So if you add yeast to the bottle, that's going to start fermentation again. Now, you have some gunky, disgusting dead yeast in your bottle, so you got to get it out. So what you do is you rotate the bottle and you keep rotating it until the bottle is standing up with the neck down. And that's called, that process is called remuage or riddling. You get a bunch of yeasty gunk in your neck, you freeze the neck, you open the bottle, and at this point, your whole bottle's under pressure, so it pops, and then you can top up your bottle, add a cork, and voila, you have champagne. Now, there are other ways, of course, to get bubbles in your wine, including adding carbon dioxide like you would for soda pop. And some of the cheaper sparkling wines do that. You can also use the transfer or the Charmat method. We'll talk about Charmat with Prosecco. Prosecco has become an extremely successful competitor. Prosecco is made from the Glera grape, and it can have up to 15% of a variety of other grapes, both Italian and international: Verdiso, Bianchetta, Trevigiana, Pereira, Glera Lunga, Chardonnay. You can see those there. It is a DOC, or Denominazione di Origine Controllata, so only produced in Veneto and Friuli Venezia Giulia, in the northeast section of Italy. There are two very important regions, Conegliano and Valdobbiadene, north of Treviso, where most of the production of quality Prosecco takes place. These are areas with high altitudes and unique soils that are particularly good for the Glera grape. Now, we know of sparkling wines coming from this particular region of Italy already in the 16th century. It's mentioned by an Englishman, Franz Morrison, in 1593. But today it has become one of the most sought after sparkling wines. It has an excellent quality to price ratio. The price point for Prosecco is much lower than champagne. It's fairly recently been introduced into the United States, and that's really when the market took off. It's been around for about 20 years. Mionetto, which you can still find here in the States, was one of the first to import. And nowadays, the Italian Ministry of Agriculture, about 10 years ago, changed the name of the grape. The grape used to be called Prosecco, but they didn't want to confuse the grape and the region. So they called the grape Glera, and now only the region and the wine can be called Prosecco. Now, the secret, of course, to this sparkling wine is the Charmat method. Invented in the mid-1880s, it was a faster way to ferment. Rather than fermenting wine in individual bottles like we saw with champagne, you do the second fermentation in a big vat. And this process was refined by Martinotti, and then it was really Eugène Charmat, a Frenchman, who industrialized the system. So the secondary fermentation doesn't take place in a bottle, but in a pressurized stainless steel tank to achieve the proper balance. Now, champagnes will have a yeasty taste because you add yeast to the bottle, but you get a kind of a fruity, flowery taste to Prosecco. And you want a kind of a consistent product and consistent bubbles, or as you see here, perlage. It's kept in these tanks for anywhere from 20 days to 3 months. And if you want a top quality Prosecco, it's up to 6 months for Cuvée and Prestige. All right. Now, we've seen an awful lot of different comparisons and contrasting. And now we could talk about organizing some tastings, hopefully in the very, very near future. So you want to invite some folks over to your house to do some tastings. All right. Now, you need a system, just because it makes it easier and it makes it fairer. It's tough to compare a really expensive wine from one area of the world made with one grape to a really cheap wine from another area of the world made with a different type of grape. So find a system. Wines from France, really specific. Wines from Napa Valley, wines made with Cabernet Sauvignon. You figure all the wines in the $15 price range. Whatever works for you and your group. You should always offer bread and crackers because you need to cleanse your palate in between the wines, because tasting several wines in a row, they all start to blend together. Water, lots of water. Headaches are a lot due to actually dehydration. So water is good for that too, but you need water to cleanse your glass in between, unless you want to offer a different glass for every wine. I tried that once. I don't have the kind of table space to do that. So you can have people rinse their wine and have people hydrate in between. The best wine glasses are similar to the ones you see in the pictures here, without faceting. Save the gorgeous crystal for the water. Not in glasses that aren't colored, because you want to see the color of the wine. You want to open your reds early so that they breathe, and you want to let your whites chill. Now, you want to do a little bit of shopping beforehand. Your glasses should be somewhat small. You know that we are a supersized culture, so you know the 18-ounce margarita glass is just not right for a wine tasting. Try to get smaller glasses, because you're going to be doing 1 to 2 ounce pours to start. Everybody should have a chance to try the wines, and then you can start drinking the wines that are left over, whatever people like. So usually we say equal amounts water to wine for a variety of reasons, and then bread or plain crackers, nothing with a lot of taste, because this is for rinsing your palate. You don't want to have that garlicky rosemary taste in your mouth. Of course, napkins, bottle openers, and garbage, recycling, whatever you're going to need for your particular situation. All right, now, when we actually do a tasting, you need lots of adjectives, because you're going to be describing the wines. So you, as the host, pour the wines. You want to encourage people to look at the wines. So what is the color of the wine? Yeah, it's going to be red, it's going to be white, but is it straw gold? Is it clear as water? Is it orangey rusty color? Is it ruby red? Is it cherry red, etc.? Take a good look. Best to do it behind a white surface like you see here. So you might want to have some white napkins or a white tablecloth or something so people can look behind it. Then you got to smell. 75% of the appreciation of wine is in your nose. Your nose has tons of receptors, and those receptors are the ones that clue you in to what the wine tastes like. Now, at the beginning, you might say smells like wine. Okay, that's great. But you need to encourage people to associate. So this wine reminds me of Grandpa. Grandpa was a smoker. Maybe one of the elements in this wine is tobacco. Gee, it reminds me of cherry pie. I always bake cherry pie in the summer. Maybe cherries are in this flavor profile. So that's what I mean by personalize the association. Then you swish the wine in your glass, and that's why you can't pour very much, because you're going to swish. Then you're going to see the legs. You're going to really aerate. You can smell it again. And at that fourth point is when you actually swallow. Professionals are going to swish it in their mouth and then spit it out, because you're starting at 8 a.m. and drinking, 20, 30 Bordeaux at a time. You can't drink them all. But you can swallow at your tasting party, as long as you know that as the host, you are legally responsible for the folks who come and drink at your house. It's when the wine is in your mouth that you can tell the tannin level of red wines, whether the wine is highly acidic, usually a white wine, etc. Okay. Now, unfortunately, if you want to do this soon, we may have to look at some virtual wine tastings. Well, you can still do it, but then you have to get everybody on board to about the purchase of the wine. Everybody should have the exact same bottle of wine in front of them. So you might only be able to do 1 or 2 wines per tasting. And again, you have a system. Everybody picks a bottle. Everybody decides what bottle from what, everybody gets to pick one, but you stick within the $15 range, something like that. But you can still do it via computer, similar to what we're doing tonight. Not as enjoyable, but it's a nice way to spend an evening until we can all get back together. So this was a really rapid overview, but I thank you all for coming along with me on this little journey. And I am going to get out of the share mode for a second so that I can see the chat questions, and then we'll go from there, and then we'll see if Emily can help us out. So I'm going to stop the sharing, And I'm going to see the chat. Here we go. So Emily, are you with us? Hi there. Emily, hi, you're still muted, I think.
I am still
Hi,
muted. Can you
great.
hear me now? Perfect. The first question that we got, which was earlier on, is if there are any specific regions that you've heard concerns about or you're aware about that might be affected by the rising temperatures we're seeing across the world. Um,
Yes, yes,
and
essentially, oh, sorry, was there a follow-up there?
the second was, what are some lesser known or new regions that may benefit from the gradual rise in temperature?
Excellent questions, both. No question that all agriculture is being impacted by the rising temperatures. Uh, we, we have we see regions, for example, already about 10 years ago in Tuscany, there was a conference asking whether or not Tuscany would be able to sustain wine production in the future because of rising temperatures. I think the most impacted thus far has been Australia, and we might actually include California in here with all of the wildfires that we see at this point almost on a yearly basis. These wildfires are actually, we actually have seen some wineries burn down, but the smoke has actually penetrated some other vineyards that weren't necessarily burned down. Australia underwent a very long-term drought, and that drought has made them they've had to change their agricultural practices. Now, wine can sustain very hot temperatures, but it can't go without water at all. Now, the Australians are fabulous at inventing things. So they invented dry viticulture, where you put a cone around the base of the vine so that any water that comes down comes straight to the vine, and they just don't irrigate. And it's kind of a Darwinian thing. The grapes that survive, survive. Areas of the world that are going to see wine production, we are actually seeing experimentation in Malmo, Sweden. So I have not tried it yet, but we shall see.
Two other questions are more specific to you. First is, how many languages do you speak? And what is your personal favorite wine and favorite wine region?
Ouch. Okay. So the language I teach French and Italian. So that's 3. And my Spanish I can understand quite a bit, and my speaking is way behind. I like learning languages, so I'm, learning. I've dabbled in a few others, and, I think that's my retirement project, actually, to discover new languages. Now, was that my favorite wine?
Yeah,
Was that the question, Emily?
favorite wine and favorite wine region.
Okay, favorite wine and favorite wine region. Okay, I am a sucker for sparkling wines, so I do love champagne. My favorite wine region, perhaps, is the Veneto, in that northeast quadrant of Italy, where they make this really weird wine, delicious though, weirdly delicious, out of semi-raisined grapes. So they let the grapes dry for 90 days on these straw mats, and then they make the wine. So it's kind of thick and a little sweet, but Amarone, if you can ever get a bottle of Amarone, but that's a one you have to have with like a roast. I mean, don't have it with fish because it'll kill the taste of your fish. But those are two of my tops.
Great. Another question was that one of the participants has just discovered Chenin Blanc, and asked if you could speak a little bit more about that wine.
Yes, Chenin Blanc is actually one of the mainstays of certain parts of the Loire Valley in France. And so Chenin Blanc has a very long history in France. It's actually a lovely wine that goes excellently well with oysters. That's what they sort of, tout it for. A nice flowery profile. And actually, now one of the big exports from South Africa, they called it Steen, the grape, but it's really Chenin Blanc. Now I think they're marketing under Chenin Blanc just so people don't get confused. But South African Chenin Blancs are delicious as well. So in your experimentation, include those in the mix.
Great. The next question was if you could define what a tannin is, and what people mean when they talk about tannins.
Great. Okay, so tannins are actually present in the skins of red grapes, in the skins of grapes, much more in red grapes than white grapes. So that's why we really talk about tannins in red wine. They are chemically, they are phenolics, and so they are. It's if you want to know the effect really of a tannin, it's tannins are also, by the way, present in tea. So you know when you drink tea and you get that kind of abrasive feeling on your palate, you should get that from a high tannin red wine as well. So, and if a winemaker wants to make a high tannin wine, when they ferment, because when you ferment the wine, what you're doing is you're crushing your grapes so that you separate your skins from the liquid. You can pull your skins immediately if you want to, but if you want a tannin wine, you allow the skins to sit there with the grape juice, and the tannins start to bleach out.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.
One participant asked that they have heard that Michigan has the same weather patterns similar to Napa and Bordeaux. Any comment on that?
Hmm. Okay, well, okay, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that. I know Michigan is certainly in the Midwest, the #1 producer. I mean, a lot of vineyards now are producing quality wines that are appearing in restaurants, even in Chicago, from Michigan. I don't know about the weather. I'll have to look at that because my anecdotal, idea of Michigan weather is very often lake effect snow coming from our part of the lake going to them. But since they have a large body of water to the west of them that is similar to what is the situation in both California and Bordeaux. So I could see we're far north, so I could see how the effects of a big body of water could be similar to what's happening in California and in Bordeaux and even in South Africa, in Cape Town, South Africa. I'll have to look into that though. Thanks for the tip.
Yeah. One other question is, what are your thoughts on Swiss wines, specifically in the, I'm probably not going to pronounce this correctly, but Montreux
Yeah.
region? Lack of presence in the larger
Yes,
world market.
I actually lived in Switzerland for 3.5 years. So I got to know Swiss wines very well. And I love their quirkiness because yes, they do make some wines out of Pinot Noir, but they really emphasize like Œil de Perdrix and, these grapes that just chasselas, that exist in Switzerland and almost nowhere else. So I always applaud that because while I love Cabernet Sauvignon, I think that areas to promote biodiversity and to promote their own culture should really emphasize the grapes that have grown there forever. Switzerland is, the topography of Switzerland has not just has some hills, but has so many very high mountains at an altitude that it's impossible to grow grapes, that they have basically exploited most of the low-lying hills where grapes could grow to grow grapes. But they still consume most of what they produce, which is why we really don't get that much export, which is too bad. Another reason is that since Swiss wines aren't too well known, and since the Swiss franc is traditionally such a strong currency, I suspect that when they do export, they're really forced to export with prices that may make them a little less appealing. But I do wish we had more Swiss wines available.
Very interesting. We will take 2 or 3 more questions here. One is that it seems that barrel aging wine, particularly in old whiskey barrels, is a common trend here in the central United States. Outside of bleaching flavors from the wood, what is the purpose of barreling wine in its very early history and today?
Okay, now the wood barrel actually was first used by the Romans, and we have evidence that actually the Romans discovered it in Gaul when they invaded current France. The Gallic tribes were already using wood as vessels for liquids. And of course, the Romans were bringing vines with them as they were conquering other places, but carrying these heavy amphora made it impossible to carry a lot of their wine with them. With the wood barrel, much lighter, they were then able to produce wine and then cart it with them. So they began using the wood barrel sort of in the post-Christian era. The wood barrel then really remained as the vessel of choice for allowing wine to age. They discovered, they didn't know why, but that putting especially red wines in wood barrels made it better. Now, the chemical reaction between the wood and the wine actually allows the tannins to soften up a little bit and allows the acidity to mellow a little bit sometimes, depending on your wine. So that's part of the reason that so many winemakers still today use wine. Now, the old whiskey barrel, now the whiskey barrels that have been previously used are kind of a common theme among many different types of alcoholic beverages. You have, for example, Scotch malt whiskey that is made in American oak barrels used for bourbon. And so here, many times wineries will use previously used barrels. Sometimes they'll use new barrels. Almost always in the United States, we use American oak. Almost always in France, it's French oak. And increasingly, we're seeing Russian oak, Slavonian oak, Hungarian oak in the mix. But it's still primarily American oak and French oak. There are slightly different flavor profiles to the two oak types of oak. So winemakers might play on that as well. I'm sorry, was there another, you said a second question?
Yeah, let's take two more questions. Of course, we want to be mindful of everyone's times. One was that one participant is reading a book called Wine Folly, The Master Guide by Madeleine Puckett, which has been a great guide for basic knowledge. Is there any other wine literature that you would recommend for people that want to learn more?
Wow. Well, in the Geography 350 class that I teach, I use the World Atlas of Wine by Hugh Johnson and Jancis Robinson. And it's now, I think, in its 8th edition. It has an introductory section, but that's a book with some gorgeous maps, number one. And number two, with very detailed descriptions of each individual region. So once I'm not sure it's an advanced book really, it's kind of maybe late beginner to intermediate book. So that's, if nothing else, it's a gorgeous book to look through with some just mouth-watering photos of vineyards.
Great. And then we can wrap it up here. There's a couple other questions in the chat that we'll try and follow up with as well, maybe individually. But the last question is, in terms of health benefits, do you know if there's a difference between rosé in comparison to red or white wine, or anything that you're comfortable speaking to there?
Well, most of the studies have been done on red wine, and from my knowledge, it's really red wine that is seen to have the most benefits. Many of the health benefits are also attributable to rosé and to white wines, but I suspect that the link is really probably in the tannins, which are in the red wines. So tannins, well, this is kind of an anecdotal thing, but tannins clearly have some effect on the iron that is in blood, for example, because you saw that it's an anticoagulant, etc. That's actually why a lot of times people say red wine with meat is really good, because if you have a red wine, it'll cut the irony taste in your red meats. So in the same way that white wines work well with fish, because fish has a lot of oil, right? We know about the omega oils now. So the white wine, the high acidity of the white wine will cut some of that oiliness. So that's, in general, that's what I would say. But I'm not an expert of this, but I could certainly follow up with you later.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate you all joining us this evening. If you have any specific questions, please feel free to email us. Our email is dpalumni@depaul.edu. If you have any follow-ups, we'll try and send out some more information as well, or respond to you individually. So thank you again, Dr. Orban.
Thank you.
Great to work with you as always.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, and stay safe, everyone.
Yes, absolutely.